In this lecture, we are going to look at what are instance attributes in Python. Don't get confused by the big word. Let's first recapitulate what we learned, that what actually is an object. So we learned that objects are the real world things that we see around ourselves. Like we have been following the example with a car, but it can be anything. Like it can be a bird, it can be an animal around you, or it can be your home or things like that. So you can model all the real things that you see around yourself as an object. We also learned that objects have two major properties, one of them being the attributes, okay, and these attributes kind of define an object. So if you have an object named car, okay, so you would have its attributes like its make, its model, its fuel type, its top speed, and things like that. We also learned that objects have their specific behaviors, just like an bird flies, an animal runs, or a car a car runs again, a ship floats over water, an aeroplane flies in the air, and things like that. So that's what we call as behavior of an object. And the behavior in case of a car is it can start, it can brake, and it can stop. So we learned all about that so far. Now, when we defined the class in Python in our previous lecture, we learned that that class is actually, its use is to define an object that would be created out of it, right? Because classes are blueprints from object design, and you can create as many objects out of it from the classes. So classes are kind of a generic design, and you use that design to create as many objects as you want. So taking the car example, if you have the basic design of a car, you can create your Lamborghini, you can create your Mercedes, you can create your BMW, and things like that. However, an important point to note here would be that it is not necessary that all those objects would have the same properties, right? Because a Mercedes would have its own make, a BMW would have its own model, a Mercedes would have its own fuel type, its own steering mechanism, its own braking mechanism. A similarly, a BMW or a Audi would have its own model, its own make, its own fuel type. So it is not necessary that the objects have the same attributes, but they can be different for different objects. But these attributes are defined via classes. So classes just define the generic attributes, but those attributes can take different values in case of different objects that you create out of that class. Over here, when you define a class in Python, you have to, sometimes use the attributes which define the individual objects that you create out of that class. And those attributes are called as instance attributes. And the property of those attributes are they are different for different objects generally. Over here, when we define the class car, we need to define the attributes like make, model, and fuel, and each of these attributes would be different for different objects that we create out of this class car. So the way to define it, I would put up the pointer at this point of time just to explain it in a better way. So you can see here that we have the class car, and over here we have a init function with variables like make, model, and fuel, and we set these variables, okay, as part of this class instance. So whenever there are objects that are created out of this class car, so we need to set these properties for those objects, and they would be done by using this init method. So this init method will be used to initialize or instantiate those objects out of this class. And we would learn about how do we instantiate that. But for the moment, we can learn that the variables that are used here, like make, model, and fuel, they are called instance variables or attributes because they define a car, but these variables would hold different value for different objects that you set out of this class. So the key points to remember here would be that class is for defining objects and their properties, just like we saw. The attributes basically make, model, fuel, and it can be anything. Their blueprint, their design. However, each individual objects that you create, okay, are called as instances or objects interchangeably. Different instances have different values for their instance attributes mostly, and we saw that using that init constructor. You don't have to call that init method whenever you create an object. Okay, it gets called automatically, and whatever values or whatever attributes you pass specifically for your object creation, it will be set automatically as attributes for the object that you create out of it. So these are the key points to remember in case of instance attributes.